I've always loved hiking. Not in the social media influencer way, no selfie sticks, no dramatic summit shots, no brand partnerships, just proper hiking. Long days in quiet places. Solitude. The kind of trails where you don't see anyone else for hours, sometimes days. I liked being away from everything, out in the open, where the phone signal dropped and the world couldn't reach me. It was early autumn the year this happened. The days were still warm, but the mornings had that crisp edge to them, and the trees had just started to fade into yellows and browns. I had taken a few days off work and driven out to a range I hadn't visited before, a mix of state forest and wilderness reserve about 6 hours from the city. I won't name it here. You'll understand why by the end. The trailhead was nothing fancy. A dirt pull-off with a rusted sign and an old wooden map board, half faded. There weren't many cars there when I arrived. Just one beat-up Subaru that looked like it hadn't moved in a few days. I figured someone else was doing a multi-day trek like I was. I parked beside it, loaded my pack, checked my GPS and compass, and started walking. The first 2 days were perfect. Just cool enough to stay comfortable, with that dry, earthy smell in the air you only get when the leaves start breaking down. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding up through thick bush, over rocky ridges, and down into gullies where the air stayed damp and shaded. I passed a few wallabies, plenty of birds, and saw the tail end of a goanna as it slid under a log, but no other people. I set up camp in a hollow beside a small creek the first night, cooked noodles over the burner, and slept under a clear sky. Everything felt normal. On the third day, I decided to take a detour. The main trail continued north, looping around the range, but I'd spotted a thin dotted line on an old paper map I had, an old logging track or fire trail, maybe, that cut across the middle and connected to another spur. It wasn't marked on any of my GPS maps, which meant it wasn't maintained, but I figured it might shave a day off my hike if it was still usable. Plus, I liked the idea of taking a less traveled route. That's what I was out there for, after all. The track was hard to find. It barely looked like a path, more like a vague indentation between the trees, overgrown and half swallowed by the bush. But it was heading in the direction I needed, so I pressed on. The terrain got rougher, steep in some places, slippery in others, and the undergrowth grew thick and noisy. My pack kept catching on branches, and I had to duck under fallen trees more than once. After a couple of hours, I started to wonder if I should turn back. But I pushed on, hoping it would open up eventually. It was just after midday when I noticed something strange. There were markings on a tree to my right, deep horizontal cuts, evenly spaced. Not natural damage. Someone had done it with a blade. At first, I thought it was just a trail marker, maybe something left by rangers or bushwalkers years ago. But then I saw another tree, a few meters ahead, with the same marks. And then another. They weren't random. They formed a pattern 3 cuts low on the trunk, 2 near the middle, 1 higher up. Almost like some kind of code. I stood there for a while, listening. The bush had gone quiet. I know that sounds like a cliché, but it's the only way I can describe it. No birds, no insects, just the wind in the canopy. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct told me to, but I didn't. I told myself it was just an old marker system, something harmless. I walked on. A little while later, I came across a clearing. It wasn't natural. The ground had been cleared of brush and rocks, smoothed out into a rough square maybe 6 or 7 meters across. In the center was a structure made of branches, 3 logs lashed together at the top, forming a sort of tripod. Hanging from the center was an old, rusted metal hook, the kind you'd use to hang a kettle over a fire. But there was no fire pit underneath, no ashes, just dirt, and more of those marks, carved into the trunks of the surrounding trees, always in sets of 3, 2, and 1. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't feel like a camp. There was no sign of sleeping mats, no rubbish, no tools. And it definitely didn't feel like anything official. Something about it felt off. Not evil, exactly, just wrong. Like a place that wasn't meant to be found. I took a few steps back, then pulled out my phone, more out of habit than anything else. Of course, there was no signal. But I snapped a few photos anyway, wide shots of the clearing, close-ups of the hook, the carvings. I figured I'd look it up later, maybe post on a hiking forum, see if anyone knew what it was. That's when I noticed something else. A small piece of cloth, tangled in the underbrush just beyond the clearing. I walked over and picked it up. It was faded, torn, looked like the corner of a jacket or a backpack strap, stiff with age. There was dirt ground into it and something that looked like dried blood. I dropped it. I turned and left. I didn't run. Not yet. But I moved fast, heart racing, eyes scanning the trees. I felt watched, like there were eyes behind every trunk. The markings continued for another 100 meters, then stopped. The path grew harder to follow, and I found myself relying on my compass to keep direction. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just kept moving. It took me hours to get back to the main trail. When I finally did, I felt like I could breathe again. I set up camp well away from the junction that night, not even bothering with dinner. I sat with my back against a rock, staring into the dark for hours. I don't think I slept more than 20 minutes at a time. When I made it back to the trailhead the next day, the Subaru was gone. I checked the map board again. There was no mention of the side trail I'd taken. I left without speaking to anyone, drove straight back to the city, and didn't unpack my gear for days. A week later, I uploaded the photos I'd taken to my computer. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of them. I posted a few on a hiking forum I'd used before, one known for its older user base and serious bushwalkers. I described the trail roughly, without coordinates, and asked if anyone had seen anything similar. The replies started rolling in. Most were just guesses: old ranger stations, cattle yards, amateur art installations. But one comment stood out. It was short. Just said, "Do you have any links or pics?" The account was new. No profile photo. No post history. I clicked on it and found nothing. No name, no location. Just that one comment. A bit weird, but I didn't think much of it. I replied with one of the photos. A minute later, the account was deleted. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, I started getting strange emails. No subject lines, just blank messages. Then came one with a photo attachment. When I opened it, I froze. It was a picture of the clearing, the same one I'd taken, but from a different angle, and closer, like someone had been standing just inside the trees, watching me take mine. I checked the email header. It was a burner address, untraceable. I changed my passwords, deleted the post, removed the photos from my computer, and stopped going on the forum. But the damage was done. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a private number. I didn't answer. The voicemail was empty, just static and faint rustling, like wind in leaves, the same sound I'd heard in that forest. I started having panic attacks, stopped hiking altogether. Every time I walked past a park or a wooded area, I felt sick. I had dreams of being in that clearing, unable to move, while something circled me just beyond the trees. I tried talking to a mate about it once, but the words felt crazy. I found a weird structure in the bush, and now someone's watching me? No one would believe that. 6 months went by. Then I saw a post in a true crime group online. Someone talking about disappearances in remote areas. A user posted a list of unsolved missing persons cases from the past decade, most of them hikers. One of the cases was in the same area I'd hiked. The photo of the missing person was a man maybe in his 30s. In the background of one of the images, I recognized a tree. The markings. I didn't say anything. I closed the browser, shut the laptop, and sat there for a long time. I never went back to that range. I've tried day hikes since, in tame, well-trafficked places, but I don't enjoy them like I used to. Every time I hear a twig snap, I flinch. I keep thinking about that rusted hook, those marks in the trees, the strange emails, the deleted account. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I don't know what that place was for. Some sort of ritual site, a hunting spot, something worse. But I know this. I wasn't supposed to find it. And I'm not the only one who did. The difference is I left. The others didn't. I was a little over 10 days into my solo section hike through a remote stretch of Pennsylvania, following a less traveled part of the Mid-State Trail. It wasn't as popular as the Appalachian Trail, which is why I picked it. I wasn't out there to meet people or make friends. I wanted long, quiet days under the trees, campfires at dusk, and cold oatmeal at sunrise. The idea was to clear my head. My job had been crushing me all year, and after my third straight month of 15-hour days, I just packed up my gear and left. My boss didn't even ask when I was coming back. The Mid-State Trail winds through some rugged areas. Lots of rock scrambles, steep ridges, and narrow ravines that force you to zigzag for hours just to gain a mile or two. But the real challenge is the loneliness. I'd go days without seeing another hiker or even hearing another person. That's the part one liked, and I thought I was used to it until I found the stone thing. It was mid-morning when I came across it, not long after a steep climb that ended on a small, rocky plateau surrounded by thick woods. I was moving slower that day because the rain from the night before had made the trail slick. My boots were caked with mud. The sky was overcast, and the whole forest felt dim and heavy, like a wet sponge. That's when I saw it. Off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the woods, something gray stuck out from the green. At first I thought it was just a big rock or a chunk of shale that had broken off from the ridge. But as I got closer, I could tell it wasn't natural. The shape was too smooth in some places, too symmetrical in others. It looked like a structure, maybe 3 feet high, built from stacked stone blocks. I dropped my pack near a downed log and walked over to it. It was a cube, almost perfectly shaped. Each side was made of flat, dark stones stacked tightly together with no visible mortar or adhesive. The blocks were so neatly fitted it was like they'd been machined. The surface was weathered, but not crumbling. No moss, no lichen, just dry stone in the middle of a wet forest. The top was flat, and in the center of it was a carved hole, circular, about the width of a soda can, maybe a little wider. It went down into darkness. It wasn't a well. It wasn't nearly deep enough. I could see the bottom, maybe 2 feet down, but something about that hole made my stomach clench. The interior of the hole was smooth, too smooth. The way it had been carved, it didn't match the rougher outer texture of the cube. There were no markings around it, no writing, no symbols, just stone. But the craftsmanship was too clean for it to be random. It looked old, but not ancient. Not something built thousands of years ago. More like someone had made it 100, maybe 200 years ago and then walked away. But what was it for? I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, even though I didn't have service. Then I circled the thing slowly, scanning the ground around it. That's when I noticed the clearing. It wasn't a clearing in the usual sense, no big open space with a view. This was more subtle, a flattened patch of ground, maybe 10 feet across, directly behind the cube. It was almost perfectly round, with no rocks or logs or underbrush. The soil looked darker there, like it had been turned or packed down a long time ago. It wasn't recent. Nothing about this place felt recent. Even the leaves looked older than the rest of the woods, like they'd been dead longer than they should have. I crouched and ran my fingers through the dirt. It wasn't soft. It was packed and dry, a little oily. I don't know how else to describe it. It clung to my fingertips. I stood up, brushed off my hands, and walked back to my pack. Something about the place made me nervous. Not scared exactly, just off balance, like I'd stepped into something I shouldn't have. I'd passed a lot of strange things on hikes. Abandoned foundations, old tools half buried in the ground, rusted cars in the middle of nowhere. But this felt different. It didn't look ruined. It looked left behind, intentionally. Still, I was curious. That night, after I made camp near a stream about 3 miles away, I opened up my guidebook. No mention of the stone structure. I checked the topo map, nothing. Not even a notation for ruins or foundations. I marked the location with a small circle and a note. Stone cube thing? Revisit? But I didn't revisit. The next day, I hiked on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the thing. Every time I stopped to rest, it came back into my mind. The smoothness of the hole, the empty clearing behind it, the dry, untouched stone. That night, I camped in a narrow valley just above a swamp. I barely slept. The woods around me were silent, too silent. No frogs, no insects, no rustling branches. Just that thick, motionless quiet that starts to make your ears ring. I lay in my sleeping bag and thought about turning around. Thought about hiking back to that cube just to take another look, just to make sure it was real. But I didn't. Instead, I kept going. I hiked for 3 more days through increasingly difficult terrain. The trail got narrow and overgrown. Trees arched above me, forming green tunnels that blocked out the sun. I started to feel tired in a way I couldn't explain. Not just physically tired, mentally drained. Every night, I'd collapse into my sleeping bag and feel like I hadn't rested at all. By the 5th night, I was done. I set up camp in a small pine grove near a trickling stream and made a fire. I boiled some noodles and tried to eat, but my stomach felt tight. The sky was dark early. No moon, no stars, just black. That night, I woke up twice in a sweat. Both times, I had the same dream. I was standing in front of the cube again, but the hole was deeper this time, and I could hear something coming up from it. Something wet and shifting. Something that didn't make sense. I woke up with my heart racing, but when I unzipped my tent and looked out, the forest was still. I waited an hour before I could go back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to head toward town. I had another 5 days planned, but I was done. My body ached in ways that didn't match the mileage I'd hiked. My thoughts felt fuzzy, scattered. I couldn't focus on the trail markers. I'd stop walking and not remember why I stopped. I started to wonder if maybe I'd touched something I shouldn't have. Maybe the stone cube wasn't just an old monument or art piece or whatever I wanted to believe. Maybe it was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts or curses or any of that nonsense. Maybe it was dangerous because I couldn't stop thinking about it, because it had taken up residence in my mind and now it was spreading. By the time I got to the trailhead and hitched a ride into town, I looked like I'd been out there for months. My eyes were sunken. I had lost 10 pounds. My legs were covered in scratches I didn't remember getting. I went to the library and tried to find any records of old structures along the Mid-State Trail. I looked at old maps, land grants, mining claims. Nothing. I asked a local historical society member if they'd ever heard of a square stone structure near the eastern ridge of the trail. He just frowned and shook his head. I posted a photo of it online on a hiking forum. Got a few replies. One guy said it looked like a field marker. Another thought it might have been an old surveyor's base. A third person linked me to a long thread where someone else had posted about the same structure years ago. That thread was what made my stomach drop. It was a different photo taken from a slightly higher angle, but it was the same cube. Same clean lines. Same smooth hole in the top. The guy who posted it said he found it on a solo hike in 2016. Said it felt out of place, and that he couldn't stop thinking about it. The last post he made was about how he was going back to look at it again to measure it more carefully. That was the end of the thread. He never updated it again. I searched his username. Nothing new since that year. I checked again the next week. Still nothing. That was 8 months ago. I haven't been back to the trail since. Haven't done any solo hiking at all. I thought the obsession would fade, but it hasn't. I still think about that cube almost every day. I see it when I close my eyes sometimes. Gray, clean, alone in the forest. I don't think it's supernatural. I think it's psychological. Like something about it triggers a loop in your brain that you can't shut off. Something about the perfection of the shape, the unnatural context, the stillness around it. It worms into you. It makes you want to go back. Not because you'll find answers, but because it wants you to look again. I still have the photo on my phone. I've stopped showing it to people. Most just shrug or say it looks like some old stone marker. Maybe they're right, but I know how it felt to stand next to it. I know how the woods felt quiet around it. I know how my mind hasn't been the same since. Some places in the woods are just quiet spots with no service and no stories. But others, some of them, aren't just forgotten. They're left alone for a reason. I think I found one of those places. And if you ever come across it too, don't touch it. Don't lean in. Don't ask what it's for. Just keep walking. I didn't say I was surprised. At that point in my hike, unusual situations had become normal. I was almost 3 weeks into a long solo trip through New Hampshire and southern Vermont, following a mix of the Appalachian Trail and quiet backcountry detours. By then, I'd accepted that I'd see and hear things most people wouldn't believe. You spend that much time alone in the woods, moving through places where time feels like it's paused, and everything starts to feel a little strange. So when I met Bill Ackerley, a man who offered me popsicles and invited me into his home to read me bedtime stories, I didn't freak out. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little uncomfortable. He was nice. That's the thing. Genuinely nice. Smiled when I walked up, offered me water, showed me the register on the side of his house where other hikers had signed in. He had this little hand-painted sign nailed to a tree that said something like, "Hikers welcome. Water, shade, rest." Stuff like that. I'd seen the name in a couple trail logs before. People seemed to know about him. They wrote things like, "Don't miss Bill Ackerley's house," or "He's a legend." So I stopped. It was hot that day, mid-July, and my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat. His house sat right on the edge of the trail, with a few big trees offering deep shade and some old lawn chairs set out in a half circle. He gave me a red popsicle, one of those long ones that come in plastic tubes. I hadn't had one since I was a kid. I sat in one of the chairs and leaned back. It was peaceful there in a weird way, just the sound of bugs and wind. Bill looked like someone's grandfather. He had gray hair, sun-spotted skin, and wore old slacks with suspenders and a tucked-in flannel shirt. I guessed he was in his 80s, maybe older. He moved slowly but with purpose. His voice was steady. He wasn't sick or feeble. He just looked like a man who'd lived through a lot of seasons. He didn't ask me too many questions, just offered me a few more snacks, pointed out where the bathroom was, and mentioned there was a bunk room in the back if I wanted to stay the night. I almost said yes. I was tempted, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't anything he did. It was the way everything around the place felt a little too still. Like the trees didn't move as much as they should have. Like the birds didn't sing close to his windows. The air had a thickness to it that I didn't notice when I was walking. Inside the house, it smelled faintly of lavender, but there was also something else underneath it. Something dusty and old, like books that hadn't been opened in decades. I thanked him and told him I'd just stay a few hours to rest. He didn't push, just nodded and said, "Suit yourself." Then he went inside. I sat there with that red popsicle melting down my hand, thinking about how weird it felt to be eating something like that on a hike. Normally, I was downing jerky and stale protein bars, but there I was, sucking on sugary ice like a kid in July. Should have been funny, but it wasn't. I felt out of place, like I'd stepped into a story someone else was writing. Eventually, I wandered over to the edge of the yard and looked through the guest book he kept in a mailbox nailed to a post. It was full of friendly entries, hikers thanking him, saying what a good man he was, how his yard was an oasis. Some of the names I recognized from trail logs, others I didn't, but all of them had the same tone. Grateful, happy, warm. Still, I noticed something odd. The guest book went back almost 15 years, but the handwriting in a lot of the entries looked the same. Different names, but the same slant in the letters. Same way of writing th with a long crossbar. Same rounded lowercase s. I told myself maybe people were just borrowing the same pen. Maybe he had some kind of template posted nearby and people just copied it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Around 6 p.m., the sun started sinking, and the shadows got long across the lawn. I knew I had to keep going. There was a lean-to about 3 miles down the trail that I could probably reach before it got too dark. I stood up, packed up my things, and walked over to the door to thank him again. It was open, not all the way, just cracked like someone left it half-closed behind them. I knocked lightly, then stepped inside. The inside of the house was tidy, too tidy, not a speck of dust on anything. Every book lined up perfectly on the shelves. Every picture frame centered on the walls. There were dozens of photos of people, most of them hikers, all smiling, all shaking hands with Bill or holding popsicles in the sun. One corner of the room had a display case full of trinkets, trail patches, old compasses, carved sticks, faded hats. But what caught my eye was the door to the back room. It was open too. I hesitated, then stepped closer. I don't know why I went in. Curiosity, maybe a stupid sense of concern. But I did. The back room was dim. No windows, just a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were 3 small beds lined against the wall, all made up with folded blankets. On each nightstand was a children's book. I stepped in, looked around. The air was heavy, like it hadn't been moved in a long time. Then I noticed the floor. There were small indentations in the wood next to one of the beds. Like a stool or a chair had been there, scraping back and forth, over and over again. And on the wall beside it, faintly, the outline of something that had hung there for a long time and was now gone. Like a picture or a poster had been removed, but the cleaner spot still remained. I backed out slowly. The skin on the back of my neck felt tight, like someone was watching me. I turned and moved quickly back through the house and stepped outside. The air felt cooler, but it didn't help the feeling in my chest. Bill was standing near the edge of the trail now, hands behind his back, looking out into the trees. I thanked him again, said I'd be moving on. He didn't answer, just stood there watching the woods. I walked past him, down the trail, trying not to break into a run. That night, I made it to the lean-to just as it was getting dark. I didn't sleep much. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I kept thinking about those beds, about the repeated writing in the guest book, about the pictures on the wall. I didn't see any recent entries from that season in the book. Nothing newer than last fall. But I had seen at least a dozen new-looking photos of hikers in his living room, and I hadn't seen a camera anywhere. The next morning, I left before dawn. I moved fast. I wanted distance between me and that house. I didn't stop to eat. I barely stopped to drink. I felt sick, like I'd come close to something that didn't want to be understood. When I reached town 3 days later, I asked a local guy about Bill Ackerley. We were sitting in the corner of a diner while I drank coffee and charged my phone. He nodded when I mentioned the name, said, "Yeah, used to be a legend up there. He passed a few years back though." I looked up from my mug. Passed? Yeah. About 4 or 5 years ago, I think. House is still up there, I guess. Some hiker said they saw it. But no one lives in it anymore. Been empty since. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and paid for my coffee. That night, I slept in a motel. Locked the door twice. I still think about that place sometimes. The photos, the popsicles, the bedtime stories laid out by each bed. Maybe someone else had taken over the house. Maybe there was some reasonable explanation. But I don't believe that. Whatever it was I walked into, I walked out fast. And I never looked back. And from now on, I don't stop at trail signs that promise shade and snacks. I keep moving, because not everything nice is safe. And not everything kind should be trusted. I grew up in Cutler Ridge, Florida. Back in the late 90s, it was just another quiet suburb tucked under the sprawl of Miami. Life there wasn't eventful, but when you're a kid, you don't need much to feel like something's an adventure. My house backed up against this long stretch of woods. Behind those trees ran a dirt path, part of an old utility road, I think, and it went on for miles, connecting neighborhoods, canal trails, and a few overgrown fields that used to be farmland. In 7th grade, I biked that path almost every day after school. It was my shortcut home and felt safer than riding along the main road with all the traffic. The trail was lined with palmettos, thick brush, and oaks covered in Spanish moss. A lot of kids used it too, on foot or bike. But you could go long stretches without seeing anyone, especially late in the afternoon. That day felt normal. I had stayed after school for a makeup quiz and was heading home later than usual. The sun was still out, but it was getting low, throwing long shadows through the trees. I had my backpack over one shoulder and was pedaling slowly, tired from the day. The air was humid, like always, and bugs buzzed around my ears as I rode. About 10 minutes in, just before the trail dipped slightly near a narrow creek, I saw something through the trees up ahead. A figure standing on the right side of the trail, half in the underbrush. From far away, it looked like someone wearing white. I assumed maybe a guy in work clothes, maybe doing surveying or something. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't that. It was a man, very much not dressed for work, or really dressed at all. He was wearing what looked like a white cone hat, the tall, pointed kind, with a draping that fell over his face and neck. It had holes cut where his eyes were. Below the mask, nothing. He was completely naked. Pale skin, skinny legs, ribs showing, feet bare and dirty. His body was covered in sweat, hair sticking to his chest. He stood totally still at first, staring at me as I rolled closer, frozen in shock. Then he started doing something I couldn't process in real time. It was something grotesque, obscene. He was touching himself right there on the trail in plain sight. I hit the brakes so hard my back tire skidded out. I nearly dropped the bike. I remember just staring, wide-eyed, unable to move or think. My brain couldn't catch up. I didn't understand it. I was 12. I didn't even know what the white hood meant at the time, just that it was wrong. He kept watching me, the holes in that hood black and hollow. Something clicked. I turned the handlebars and pushed off with one foot, taking off down the trail without looking back. My legs were moving faster than they ever had. My backpack bounced against my spine. My handlebars shook. I didn't stop pedaling until I was out of the woods and into the open streets of my neighborhood. I ran inside my house, left my bike lying in the front yard. My mom wasn't home yet. I remember locking all the doors and shutting the curtains before I even drank water. I sat in the kitchen for what felt like forever, shaking and sweating, still trying to make sense of what I had seen. I didn't tell anyone for days. How could I? What do you even say about something like that? Eventually, I mentioned it to a friend, trying to turn it into some kind of joke, something less real, less horrible. He laughed. I laughed too, but it wasn't funny. Stuck with me, and it didn't stop there. That path? I never rode it again. Even when other kids said nothing weird ever happened to them. Even when people told me it was just my imagination or a prank or maybe some crazy homeless guy. It wasn't a prank. It was real. That image burned itself into my memory in a way I couldn't shake. I had nightmares, not every night, but often enough. They were never graphic. Just the same shape, that same man, standing still between the trees, always watching. Years went by. I stopped biking, got older, moved out. I buried it somewhere in my mind, like we do with things we can't understand. But I still couldn't drive past that stretch of woods without feeling my throat close up. I never told my parents, never told a teacher. Maybe I should have. I didn't want to be labeled. I didn't want to be the kid who saw the pervert in the woods. So I kept quiet. Then, one day years later, I was online reading local news out of boredom, just skimming headlines from back home. I came across a report about a man arrested in Homestead. Charges: public indecency, indecent exposure, and a handful of other disturbing offenses. It wasn't the same guy, I knew that, but what stopped me was how they found him. He'd been living out in the brush behind an old canal road, squatting in a little camp he built himself. There were photos of the site. Tarps, makeshift poles, weird symbols scratched into plywood. They said he'd been approaching teenagers in secluded places, always half-naked or in costume, always watching, never speaking. The news story was just a few paragraphs long, buried in the crime section. I sat there staring at the screen, not because it was him, but because it meant there were others, that this wasn't just some isolated event, that people like him, with sick ideas and time to act on them, really do wander into the woods and wait, knowing the rest of us will just keep moving, trying not to look too long, trying to pretend we didn't see it. I never reported what I saw. Maybe I should have. Maybe some cop would have taken it seriously. Maybe it would have been written off. But I'll say this, what happened changed the way I look at empty places. Woods, fields, even quiet neighborhoods. I still love nature, but I never go in alone anymore. Because once you've seen something like that, you realize the woods don't have to be haunted to be scary. Sometimes the scariest thing out there is just a man breathing, watching, and nothing else. In 2012, I set out to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail. I was 28 then, burned out from work, fresh off a breakup, and looking for something to clear my head. I'd done smaller hikes before, sections of the Long Trail in Vermont and some backcountry camping in Shenandoah, but nothing close to this. The AT was something I had been reading about since high school. I was in shape, had time, and no real ties holding me back. So I went for it. Georgia to Maine, over 2,000 miles of rocks, roots, ridges, and rain. By the time I made it to Virginia, I'd gotten into the rhythm. Wake up at dawn, pack gear, hike 10 to 20 miles, eat, sleep, repeat. Trail life stripped away everything unnecessary. You forget about your phone. You stop thinking about the news. You become leaner, quieter, more observant. The trail shapes you. It also tests you. There were days I felt like a machine. Other days, I sat under a pine tree and questioned why the hell I was even doing this. But that day, the one that stuck in my memory more than any other, started like any other. Clear skies, a cool breeze, and a quiet section of trail just past Waynesboro. I had heard about a guy from other hikers a few days before. Everyone referred to him as the ice cream man, said he lived just off the trail and offered through hikers popsicles or root beer floats. That kind of thing. Trail angels came in all forms. People who left water jugs on dry stretches, drove hikers to resupply points, or left granola bars hanging from trees. So the idea didn't strike me as too weird. People said his house was right on the edge of the woods near a dirt pull-off, maybe 5 or 10 minutes off the at. It was late morning when I got there. I just crossed a small gravel road where the trees opened up for a bit. There was a mailbox with a faded red flag. No number, just a rusted tin lid hanging crooked. Beyond it, a short path veered slightly to the right, and sure enough, it led to a small white house tucked into the trees. It was a simple place. One story, wooden siding, mossy shingles on the roof, a big oak tree in the front yard. There was no fence, no decorations, not even a visible car. A beat-up lawn chair sat near the porch. The place was quiet, not abandoned, just still. I hesitated near the edge of the yard. I'd seen bears, snakes, even a few shady characters on the trail before, but this gave me a weird pause. I couldn't explain why. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I was hungry. I could almost taste the creaminess of a cold orange popsicle. I walked up the short stone path and knocked on the door. No sound. I knocked again, a little firmer this time. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. Slowly, like in a movie, but not theatrical. Just slow and careful. An old man stood in the doorway, thin, wearing a white shirt and tan pants held up by suspenders. He had thick glasses, the kind that distorted the shape of his eyes a little, made them seem bigger. He had a friendly face. He looked at me, blinked, then smiled and nodded, gesturing for me to come in. I followed. I shouldn't have. The interior was dim, smelled faintly of old wood, vanilla, and something less distinct, maybe musty clothes or dust. The kitchen was small but clean. Formica countertops, a round table in the center with 2 wooden chairs. No TV, no computer, just some old ceramic jars on a shelf and a rotary phone on the wall. He led me by the wrist. Not hard, but firmly enough that I didn't question it in the moment. He guided me to the kitchen table, sat me down, then opened a creaky freezer and pulled out a popsicle. Orange and white. He unwrapped it carefully and placed it in front of me on a napkin. I took a bite. Cold, sweet, exactly the kind of thing that hits hard after days of lukewarm trail mix and oatmeal. Then, without a word, he walked over to a small bookshelf in the corner, pulled out a children's book, and sat across from me. Where the Wild Things Are. I recognized the cover. He opened it and began to read, his eyes scanning the page slowly. He didn't speak aloud, just read silently, turning the pages with deliberate care. His hand occasionally trembled, but he never looked up at me, just kept reading, page after page. I sat frozen, gripping the popsicle stick. Something in the pit of my stomach began to churn. The kind of gut feeling you get when you're somewhere you shouldn't be. I wasn't scared at first. Not exactly. Just confused. Uneasy. I felt like I had stepped into someone else's world. A very private, carefully controlled world. And now I was part of whatever was happening. I finished the popsicle, setting the stick down quietly. The man reached the end of the book and closed it. Then he finally looked at me. His eyes behind the thick glasses seemed distant, like he was seeing something else. I stood up slowly, thanked him with a nod, unsure of what else to do, and backed away toward the door. He stayed seated, still staring. I let myself out, walked down the path, and didn't stop until I was back on the heart pounding harder than it should have been. My hands felt clammy. I sat down on a log about 50 yards up the trail and tried to catch my breath. The whole thing hadn't been threatening, exactly. He didn't do anything to me. He gave me a popsicle and read a children's book. But it wasn't right. It wasn't normal. It felt like I had walked into a moment stuck in time. Something the world had left behind, but that was still living on, just out of sight. I pushed on. Hiked another 15 miles that day. That night at the shelter, I brought it up to a couple of other hikers I had been leapfrogging for weeks. One guy had heard of him, said he'd stopped by too. Got a root beer float, nothing else. Another guy said the place gave him the creeps and he'd skipped it altogether. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't say how he held my wrist. Didn't say how he read the book in silence like it was a ritual. Didn't mention how his eyes never blinked as I left. I didn't want to make it a bigger thing than it was. But it stayed with me. The weeks rolled on. I finished the trail in September, reaching Katahdin with blistered feet, torn knees, and a pride I hadn't felt in years. But that memory, that orange popsicle in the quiet house, followed me all the way to Maine. After the hike, I went home, shaved, got back into the job market. Life moved on. But sometimes, especially when I was tired or sitting in silence, I'd think about him. That man, that kitchen, that silent story reading. I decided to look him up once, just to see if there was anything online. Maybe an article, a news story, something to explain it. I found almost nothing. A few old trail journals mentioned him in passing. Some called him generous. Others mentioned how weird it was. One blog post from 2009 described an unsettling visit with an old guy who gave me a frozen treat and made me sit at his kitchen table while he talked about his dead wife and cats. That was it. No address, no last name, no real info, just pieces. Then, in 2014, someone posted on a hiking forum that the Ice Cream Man house had burned down. No details, just that the house had gone up in flames and wasn't there anymore. That was it. Nothing in the local news. Nothing in the records I could find. No obituary. No police report. Just gone. A small white house erased from the edge of the woods. I don't think about it often anymore. Life keeps you busy. But sometimes, I'll be walking through the frozen aisle at the grocery store and I'll see one of those orange cream popsicles, the kind with the vanilla inside and orange coating, and it'll hit me all over again. The smell of the kitchen, the way the man held my wrist, the pages of a children's book turning, one by one, in a silence that felt far too loud. And I'll wonder what exactly I walked into that day, who he was, what had happened in that house before, and whether I had stumbled into something I was never meant to see. A world held together by ritual, memory, and a storybook fantasy he'd been living alone for years. He didn't hurt me, but I've never forgotten him, and I don't think I ever will. It was late spring when we went bushwalking through Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. I remember that time of year because the days were starting to stretch out a bit, the air was warm but still comfortable, and the mosquitoes hadn't quite hit their peak. I had just finished my first year at uni, and my mate Darren had been itching to get away from Sydney for a few days. He'd recently broken up with his girlfriend, and I think he just wanted to be out in the bush where he didn't have to talk to anyone or think about much. I'd only been to Belanglo once before with a school camp group, and even then, I remember something about the place gave me the creeps. Maybe it was how quiet it got once you stepped off the main trails, or how the wind moved through the tall trees with that weird, humming sound. Or maybe it was just the feeling you get in old forests, like the ground's holding on to things you shouldn't dig up. We drove out early one Saturday morning. Darren's Uda was loaded up with supplies. Tent, food, water, extra gear, everything we thought we might need. The plan was to park near the fire trails, follow a less-used track we'd read about in an old hiking forum, and make camp somewhere remote for 2 nights. Nothing fancy, just a bit of walking, maybe some photography, and a chance to disconnect. We both had compasses, topo maps, and our phones were fully charged with offline GPS maps just in case. We weren't dumb about it. At least, we didn't think we were. We hiked in about 9 or 10 kilometers the first day, veering off the main fire trail and following a thinner track that looked like it hadn't seen regular use in years. Parts of it were barely more than animal paths. The deeper we went, the more overgrown things got. There were patches where the underbrush grew right up to our knees, and you had to sort of push your way through. About midway through the afternoon, we found a clearing off to the left side of the path. It wasn't big, maybe 10 meters across, and the trees opened up just enough for sunlight to get through. The ground was mostly level, and there were no widowmakers hanging over the spot, so we decided it was good enough to make camp. We set up the tent, unrolled the mats, and started boiling water for a freeze-dried meal. That night, the forest around us went dead quiet. No animal sounds, no wind. It was like the trees were holding their breath. I barely slept. The next morning, we left most of our gear in camp and continued walking a bit further along the same rough trail. We weren't planning to go too far, just enough to explore a bit and stretch our legs. We passed through a dry gully and had to scramble up a steep ridge that was more rock than dirt. On the other side of it, maybe 200 meters down, we came across the strangest thing I've ever seen in the bush. It was a platform, kind of, made out of flat stones, maybe the size of a single mattress. It was laid out too cleanly to be natural. The rocks were stacked in a low square shape, maybe 1 foot high, and the top was filled in with smaller stones, all arranged to form a flat surface. It didn't look like a fireplace or a campsite. There was no sign of ash or burnt wood. It just sat there in the middle of the bush, silent, weirdly clean, with no clear purpose. Neither of us said anything for a while. Darren just walked around it in a slow circle, then sort of stood there looking at it with this confused expression. I remember feeling cold all of a sudden, even though it was probably over 20 degrees. Something about it felt off. Not just out of place, but wrong. Like we weren't supposed to be there. After maybe a minute or two, we both just turned and started heading back. We didn't talk about it. I don't think either of us knew what to say. That night, back at camp, we didn't even bring it up. We sat by the fire, ate, listened to the bush noises come back to life, and both went to bed early. I barely slept again. I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping, something shifting through the leaves. I told myself it was possums or wallabies, but I kept waking up and listening hard for footsteps. None ever came, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We packed up and hiked out early the next morning. The entire walk back to the Uda, I kept glancing behind us. I don't think I've ever been more aware of how alone you can be out in the bush. No cars, no phones, just trees and silence and the crunch of boots on gravel. The platform stayed on my mind for weeks after. Darren didn't mention it again, and I didn't bring it up. We both just moved on, or tried to. A few months later, it would have been around October, I was sitting at home one evening watching the telly when a segment came on one of those current affairs shows, the kind that runs crime stories and missing persons pieces. This one was different though. They were talking about a bloke who'd just been arrested, Ivan Milat, in connection with a string of backpacker murders that had taken place across several years. They showed photos of the forest, footage of police combing through thick bushland with markers and flags, and then they showed something that stopped me cold. It was grainy footage, probably from a news crew helicopter. The camera zoomed in on a square stone platform, hidden deep in the bush. It was exactly like the one Darren and I had found. Exactly. Same size, same shape, same clean, unnatural arrangement. The narrator said something about how these altars had been found near several of the graves, typically within 300 yards, and no one could explain exactly what they were used for. Ritual? Staging? Trophies? No one knew, but they kept showing up. I felt sick watching it. My palms were sweaty. My stomach felt like it had dropped into my legs. I called Darren that night for the first time in weeks. I didn't even have to say what I was calling about. He picked up, and before I could speak, he said, "It was the same one, wasn't it?" "Yeah, it was." Over the next few months, the case exploded in the media. More evidence came out. More victims were named. Milat's face was everywhere. There was talk, rumors mostly, that someone else might have been involved, that Milat couldn't have done it all alone. Some of the timelines didn't line up perfectly. Some witnesses claimed they'd seen other people with him, but no one else was ever charged. They had their guy, and the rest just sort of faded into speculation. I followed the trial like a hawk. Every day there was a new article, new detail. The police gave interviews. They said some of the altars were only 100 meters from where they dug up bodies. Some were just hidden behind rises in the land, invisible unless you knew what to look for. They theorized that the killer or killers had used them for something, marking a site, maybe even returning to it. Theories flew around, but nothing was confirmed. Darren and I never went bushwalking again. We barely saw each other after that, actually. Something about that trip had changed us both. I'd go so far as to say it aged us, like we'd touched something out in that forest that we weren't supposed to. I kept thinking back to that moment we stood there looking at the platform. What if we'd gone just a bit further? What if we'd been there at the wrong time? Some nights I wake up thinking about it. The stone platform, the quiet trees, the strange absence of birds. I think about how close we might have been to one of those shallow graves. How many of those poor souls were buried just out of sight? I think about the man they caught, the face that became burned into the national consciousness, and I think about how they said someone else probably helped him, someone who never got caught. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, we weren't as alone in those woods as we thought we were.